Good afternoon, everyone. This is a meeting of the South Kingstown Subcommittee for Landscape Regulations. The date is 4/28/26, and the time is 5:40. Jamie, would you like to start off with a recap of where we're at and
Sure, Madam Chairman. So we last met on March 24th, where we went through the handout from Randy Collins. It's a five-page kind of synopsis and outline of some of the regulatory intents and things that should be included in any good landscape plan related to the regulations of that. We went through kind of the user's experience, what's feasibility, some of the problems associated with regulatory controls. We talked about diagrams for tree protection. We talked about landscape design and where some of that, provisions from the regulatory side, when you say, 10% of your parking lot needs to be landscaped, that's potentially a well-intended regulation that has unintended consequences, because some developer may say, I'm going to stick it in the back left corner, that's my 10%, and you get no landscaping to the parking lot. So kind of careful what you're asking for, because what you're asking for may not be what you intend as a product. So we talked a little bit about that, and then I think there was some discussion on the type of plant material and amount of plant material you require, and the ability to water during the the first 1 or 2 growing seasons, and then have a long-term sustainable landscape. Also, we talked about parking lot buffers, and my notes are that we're on or about page 3, and that we touch upon page 3 and then move forward from there.
okay, so Susan asked if we could go back, as she had some comments prior to page 3, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so.
We talked about that, I just didn't take a note
Sure.
of.
Go ahead.
Okay. Right on page 1, we have the limit of disturbance shall be the minimum area of a site that will be disturbed. Is that the definition of limit of disturbance, and isn't that then the maximum area that will be disturbed? Or are we saying we only want them to disturb a minimum area, and do we need to expand on that?
Good observation, and again, it's defining what a disturbance is. So the limits of disturbance under this definition would be the area an applicant is proposing to disturb as a result of their development. In the regulations right now, you do not have minimums and maximums. So I think you've seen a few developments that come in at, whether they're 2 acres or 10 acres, that their limits of disturbance are in essence property line to property line to property line to property line, but nothing in our regulations prevents that, because so long as they incorporate buffers and landscaping into the new development, they can be regulatory compliant. So again, these are some of the things. This is one of the cards in the deck, and how do you want to potentially better define it? But Randy's saying you need to clearly have a definition for limits of disturbance, and then at some point you need to codify, are there any limitations to the amount of area you can disturb?
Jamie, question. I don't understand why that wouldn't be the maximum area. Why wouldn't the limit of disturbance be the most that you could disturb?
So one's a definition and one's a regulatory item. So look at the definition of a front yard setback is the area along a street's frontage set by a dimension from that front property line. That's the definition of what frontage is and a front yard setback is. There's a whole regulatory section that would say what you can and can't do in a front yard setback. So limits of disturbance is a definition. It does not codify any regulatory aspect associated with it, other than it's a defined term that would need to be shown on a site plan. So you don't have a regulation right now that says you can only disturb 80% of your property. That's a dimensional regulation.
But that's a maximum.
Correct, but in most instances, you wouldn't set a minimum on limits of disturbance.
But this says minimum.
Because it's the minimum area that you calculate. Use the term minimum or maximum, it's the area that you calculate.
But right now, my limits of disturbance go up into the required buffer. And so on a plan, I've got this little dotted line that's like my building envelope is like, I can build anything I want in that space, up to the setback or buffer or whatever. Like, isn't that what the little dotted line that shows, like,
That's
this
the
is,
limit of, that's your building envelope, that's not your limits of disturbance.
can't I disturb anything on my property up till I get to that buffer, the required buffer? Or
You could-
required actually,
there
I
isn't-
can disturb the setback, I just can't build in it.
Correct.
So I'm just,
It's good, I think it's
if you understand it, that's good.
It is
but I'm-
confusing.
I'm really confused by what this actually is. So either I think I want clarification, or I want it expanded on, or I still don't understand it, and you're telling it to me, so I'm confused by that statement.
We can look at clarifying it.
What have you got next?
I feel like we might have talked about this last month, but in the submission requirements, number 1, landscape plan preparation, the last sentence says, we want to create a site character that is compatible with the surrounding development and community character. I'm not sure that compatible with the surrounding development is always a desirable thing, depending on what your neighbors have going on. So I don't know if we always want to demand that it be compatible, because if this property is sandwiched between, a junkyard and,
a junkyard.
and some storage containers, like, how do we make this clear that we're not just looking for compatibility? And plus, compatibility, I think, is a relative term, and your compatible is not the same as my compatible, so I think we need to clarify that.
And I think that sentence probably came from what we are commonly referring to as compatibility with the existing streetscape, like when we have stone walls along a road, that, and appropriate green space. That, I think that language had that in mind.
Yeah.
But we want to be sure that, if there's a junkyard on the left, we don't.
Yeah, and if I have a stone wall, but none of the other neighbors do, well, let's take it out, because that's not, you know what I'm saying? Like, I guess.
Right, yeah,
It's not, I think compatible is not always desirable, depends on your neighborhood. Okay, so that's why you comment on that.
I was thinking you might actually want to opt for a double negative, which would make it is not incompatible with the surrounding development, because that actually gives you more freedom. Incompatible.
But if I do something really, really nice, it would be incompatible with
With
the
the junkyard.
not-so-nice next
Right,
property next
with
to it.
something
Yes.
So again,
adjacent.
we can look at terminology. And
Okay,
I think, to prior conversations and work sessions we'd had on changes to legislation and regulatory review, you were seeing state legislatures, whether it's, Portland, Oregon, San Diego, or California, removing terminology like compatible with the quality and character of a neighborhood, because those are viewed as arbitrary and harder to define, yet in most instances, the local land use committees and boards know exactly what that means. But if you were sitting on the developer side and you did all this landscaping and all this architecture sitting in front of a planning board, and the public's still saying, well, you're not compatible, and they've designed an extremely attractive development, and you're still debating the merits of compatibility, which is almost impossible to define.
so the site character or characteristics should be, could reflect the coastal community character or something, so that it's not like just comparing to your neighbor.
Yeah, and I think what Rich Bourbonnais suggested over time, that there's potentially, from a landscape perspective, there's maybe 3 or 4 or 5 zones in town that you have kind of that, you know, if we were within 500 yards, 1,000 yards of the shoreline, and I was developing a piece of land and was doing a cul-de-sac, and the regulations required that you plant street trees on the right and left of the road, and it says sugar maples, red maples. Well, you may not want sugar maples or red maples 500 yards inland of the Atlantic Ocean, which is susceptible to high winds, and those trees have full canopy, and in hurricane season would potentially be uprooted, where there's a different transitional zone south of Route 1. Then you have suburban, urban, and extremely rural.
I have a note, I think it's meant to reflect number 2, the content requirement, but it's also useful for the paragraph we're talking about. Randy had found some illustrations in color that are much more meaningful and more impactful to what we're trying to achieve. So that could be very helpful.
And that was a point I've made earlier in workshops, that from a code perspective, if you can add graphics to the words, it helps exponentially.
It really
Like
does.
discussing, you know.
Are you ready for page 2?
All right, so I have to figure out on number 1, site feature protection, why I just put a big fat star next to it and what I meant to that. I am hyper interested in being more thoughtful about some of the features we have here in South Kingstown, especially stone walls. And I think that that mention of a stone wall is the only mention of a stone wall anywhere in here. And maybe that's what my star was that maybe I would like to, in my perfect world, have some kind of regulations for not the thoughtless dismantling of the stone walls that we're finding on a lot of these, especially these farm sites. And if it's really in the way, it should be rebuilt in some visual place where it's compatible with the neighboring properties and not used as filler for the stormwater thing in the back. And I would like to see some kind of protection, or at least thoughtfulness about stone walls, and thoughtfulness about the big trees, which I know we talked about. You know, like right now, there's a site in town that's being completely clear-cut, and we're never gonna have the opportunity to talk about the mature trees because they've already been cut down. But replacing a 24-inch tree with a 1-inch sapling, I don't feel like that should be an option, because those little saplings, I know 30 years from now there'll be something to see, but it shouldn't be so easy to run to the nursery and drop $50 on a sapling and make all the big trees go away. I don't want to make it that easy to cut all the big trees down. And I know some are in the way of your project, but like that site right now that hasn't even been sold yet, and they've completely clear-cut it. Like, come on, like, how do we prevent that from happening? So maybe that's what my big star was.
And I have that comment further down, next page too. It's related to that.
Then the one after that, number 2, at the end of the second line, it says the word "where feasible." And I've become enough of a cynic on the planning board to be where feasible doesn't mean anything.
I have it crossed out. I think we took it out.
Oh,
at the
good.
meeting.
That
Yeah.
makes me happy. Okay. So I'm just behind the scenes on that. And that's all I have on page 2, and then I've got a
Okay.
couple of things on page 3.
All right, let's go to page 3.
Are we all on page 3 anyway?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, guys.
All right.
Just,
so-
Maria, just quickly on the protecting mature trees and stone walls, I have a comment that ends up being a legal question. And terminology I use is, you know, stone walls should be protected and/or reintegrated into the development plan. The difficulty is if I have seen historically, if that municipalities become too stringent on the criteria associated with tree protection or stone wall protection, pre-development, large trees are removed, stone walls are removed, and then developers apply. And when they apply, there are no longer any trees to protect because they're gone, and there are no longer any stone walls to reincorporate because they've been sold. And they're,
But if that's all we could ask for in the end anyways, we can't even talk about stone walls and trees. They cut them down now, they cut them down later. Like, at least, what can some
what I'm
municipalities
saying,
do to
there
protect
needs to be a
those?
middle road for the developer.
So then maybe at the discretion of the planning board becomes where the planning board can say, okay, I understand that that stone wall is completely inappropriate where it is, let's find a compromise. Like, we don't have to demand every stone wall never be touched, but there might be a compromise somewhere. But right now, they can take them all out and make them riprap to the stormwater, so there's no loss here.
Well, they don't usually use those kind of stones necessarily for riprap,
But
because
I
there's
know of
more
one project
specific.
we've had that all of those stones became the
But
stormwater.
It's not the norm. And we do have language that we use pretty consistently that all stone walls will be reused on site. Maybe we need to be more specific about how they can or cannot be used. All stones are used on site. Right, or stones, right. And I know that several years ago, one of our reps, Leona Kelly, put in legislation, I need to find it, that allows you to protect stone walls. So I need to look that up. Right, yes, yep.
Allows you to protect stone walls during the application process. That's potentially usually the key in the legislation.
I'll have to look
It's
for it.
pre-development that a lot of things occur.
Okay. What else from folks on page 3?
I have a comment on number 8, and it's the same comment on number 9 for parking lot planting buffer. So it says that a landscaped area of not less than 10 feet shall be provided around parking lots. If there's already a naturally occurring forested buffer at that site, I would potentially prefer not to see any of that removed to make room to put in a 10-foot wide landscape buffer with one shade tree per 30 linear feet. Like, is there some kind of provision where a naturally occurring forested buffer can remain if it's a desirable, naturally occurring forested buffer? And so the same thing would be so 8 and 9, I had the same comment.
It's certainly not a bad idea. It would save the money, provided that the naturally occurring buffer has healthy trees that aren't, not so old that they're going to die in 2 years.
Right, but I'm thinking about along a wooded stretch of roadway where there's just forest, and then
Mhm.
boom, it stops, and then there's this lawn area with hydrangea. You know what I'm saying? Like, it may be desirable in some cases just to continue that forested continuity down the road.
You mean as in adding planting or as utilizing the forested? Are you assuming the forested area is on site or adjacent to the lot?
I guess this buffer, especially along the streetscape, demanding that there be a landscaped strip as opposed to,
Remember, there's a non-residential development. There's the
Right.
IND1, near commercial neighborhood, so most of those areas are in some phase of development or historic development.
if it's a gravelly piece of roadside and they're gonna put some shrubbery in, I'm all about that. But if there's forest, let's say it was out along like Liberty Lane, and there was a whole stretch of forest along the roadway, could that not remain as the buffer as opposed to installing something that needs maintenance and watering and fertilizer and will die in a couple of seasons? Like, let's just let them leave the forest if there's an appropriate forest there. That was my thought on that. You don't have to agree, it's just my thought on that.
You could easily accommodate that by adding at the end, if a naturally occurring buffer of comparable size with healthy vegetation may be substituted, if exists, this may be substituted for the aforesaid landscaped area.
again, you can add at the discretion of the planning board or the AO or whoever is judging
Right,
those.
so that it's healthy and appropriate.
Yeah, so there's another pair of eyes on it, but that's a flexible
Yep.
alternative.
Right, this just creates more flexibility. Anything else on page 3? All right, let's go to page 4. I know I have 1, 2, 3, 4. The 5th bullet down, I have a no and impracticable underlined, because that is often used to circumvent regulations.
But it does give us an option to say that we may approve something else.
Yep,
So it's not just up to the developer. to
so maybe we just need to change that word, or,
Like, if it's truly impractical, we don't have a choice, right?
well, this is different. This is a legal term that's used all the time. Any thoughts, Jamie?
In new development, in most instances, you can become code compliant, right? There,
Right.
if you
You're
had.
starting with the blank
you know,
canvas,
We'll
yeah.
take, you had a 3-acre piece of land and you were building a small market on it or a small retail endeavor. There's nothing potentially that prevents you from designing your building and designing your parking lot and landscaping, everything in a code compliant manner. Where it becomes non-compliant is typically when a developer wants a building bigger than compliance allows, right? So I'm just gonna use an analogy. On a 2-acre site, you can do a 15,000 square foot building and 30 parking spaces, and it fits perfectly, all the buffers, all the landscaping, all the storm drainage. But a developer comes in and instead of wanting 15,000, wants 20,000 square feet, requires 40 parking spaces, and then they talk to the planning board and staff about how it's impractical to do the nice landscape islands because it doesn't fit. And then the discussion is why doesn't it fit? It doesn't fit because your building size and parking requirements don't allow you to landscape it, and that's you impose that on yourself. There are other developments, and we'll use Chipotle's as an example, that existing site, existing building, a lot of nonconformities to reutilize that building, whether it was a restaurant converted to a restaurant. So there, someone could argue that the redevelopment of a property, given the existing configuration, the limitations I have because my property lines are set, I have to modernize because I have to put stormwater where stormwater never was. And in order to do that and make it financially viable, something has to give. And sometimes buildings can't get smaller because you wouldn't be able to repurpose or redevelop a property. So the terminology, there can be an instance where it does become impractical, giving existing site constraints. But that 2-acre piece that's never been developed, that's got sewer, water, and a building fits, only becomes impractical when it's self-imposed. Infill redevelopment, I think it's a terminology. I can write legal next to that and see if we can over time, add an additional sentence or two that tries to, impracticality cannot be self-imposed.
Right, exactly. So
Right.
if there's a way to further define it so that it's clear that in a Chipotle situation is not the same as someone coming in and asking for triple the,
Use an example, CBS. Say someday CBS goes away, and someone buys CBS and says they want to do a restaurant there. And the new regulations require that any new redevelopment requires you to be completely code compliant, and you talk to the applicant and say, look, you gotta go in and put landscape islands, every 10 spaces needs an island and another canopy tree. And in order for them to meet the parking standards for the new restaurant, they either have to downsize, which means, cut 5,000 square feet off the building. Probably wouldn't make someone do that, so the redevelopment of that property potentially becomes impractical due to the existing constraints, and we potentially can try and codify that versus just, I'm supersizing my site, therefore I want relief.
But since you brought up Chipotle, Chipotle is sitting surrounded on a couple of sides by a deep sloped woodland. By these regulations, and I remember this happened when they came before us, they need to put in some kind of buffer. So putting in a treed buffer along their back parking lot, which just leads out into a 30% slope and a whole lot of wetland, where you could never build anything, there'll never be a neighbor back there, putting a buffer along that parking lot didn't make a lot of sense. And I remember talking to them when they were here about, well, it's okay with me if you want to take that buffer and move it up to the front where actually we'd like to see some trees. But I think that these regulations might not give us the flexibility to say, well, you're abutting the great swamp, maybe you don't need a buffer back there because there's never going to be development and it's all forested. Why force them to put a buffer in along that property line?
well, doesn't the second part of the last bullet say that? They can approve a modification to the requirements as long as there is no net loss of planted area number of trees required.
But I understand, one thing we can't do as planners and board members is predict the future. We can anticipate changes that may occur in the future, but it's unpredictable. So imagine on the north side of that Chipotle bus, it was a pine grove. And if we all remember, maybe in the last 10 to 15 years, what happened to some substantial stands of pine groves in Rhode Island and New England? They were devastated by a small insect that killed entire stands of trees. So, Susan, to your point, you say it's always going to be there. To my point, it may not always be there. So again, is it practical, or is there a better way to use the developer's resources to enhance other components of the site? And our discussions in our office, and I try to instill this in the planners that are working under me, that if the regulations require someone to plant 20 trees and 40 shrubs, that the planning board would potentially entertain relief so long as it was still 20 trees and 40 shrubs, but they maybe are redistributed amongst the site, but you're not asking for not having to do something. It's just using those resources differently to achieve a goal in a slightly different manner, that you can say, does it meet the intent of the reg? Yes. Is it 100% codified? No. But relief was granted, and it's still 40 shrubs and 20 trees.
On 13, I have depending on species underlined, because it's important that someone reading this doesn't say, oh, I can plant anything, however small it might be, 30 to 40-foot spacing. It depends on what you're planting.
So you don't want paper bark, birch trees that grow a foot every 10 years.
Right.
I think there's some practicality, and I think potentially what's missing there is a definition of a shade tree. Right? That a Bradford pear is not a shade tree.
Right,
Bradford pear is ornamental, so I think it's defining what shade trees
Right.
are, defining what ornamentals are, defining what
And the-
understory
yep.
is.
the cherries,
Yeah.
the ones that aren't used anymore.
Can we go back to 11?
Yep.
All developments over 2 acres shall provide, is that 2 acres of the entire site, or 2 acres of the developed portion? Is the development 2 acres, or is the site 2 acres?
I read it as the site.
Well, it can be solved very easily by adding sites after development.
I think the intent there is that if it's a 2-acre, no, site. I'll use it. If you had 2 acres and we're putting a farm stand on the 2 acres, are you required to do at least one outdoor gathering space? No less than 750. See, I think it's scalable to the size of the development, that if you were doing a 2-acre farm stand, that you're doing a public gathering space.
But if I had a 15-acre site,
Hi.
and I was clear cutting 2 acres to put in houses, is that,
It's not about clear cutting, it's the size of your development. In your example, if I was doing a,
so my limit of disturbance is gonna be 2 acres?
say that again, Susan?
The limit of disturbance is like, what is 2 acre, I guess I don't understand what 2 acres refers to, and I feel like I might need clarification on
Right,
what
but the-
exactly is happening in those 2 acres.
This is not, it's my understanding that item 11 would not apply to a residential subdivision. This is for commercial
Oh,
space. And again, it's the, Randy's giving us components that are important to a code, but they're not intended to be all-inclusive.
Sorry, everything we're looking at here, like,
You're not
gathering-
buffering a parking spot on a single-family lot. You're buffering a parking lot associated with commercial and industrial uses.
am I not buffering a parking lot associated with a,
Multifamily would fall into that category.
okay. So if I've got a whole subdivision of townhouses with a big parking lot, is
That's
that not,
multifamily.
that doesn't need to be buffered
No, that would be buffered,
with these regulations?
yes.
So the gathering spaces doesn't just refer to commercial spaces, it also refers to,
It could occur to
Subdivisions.
multifamily. Again, these are components that we're working through.
right, so didn't you just,
This is not intended to be your code.
no, but I think about.
I guess I not
when
under,
Susan asked on the Curtis Corner project to have one little space for the kids to play.
oh my God.
And this would have,
Village at Curtis Corner is a subdivision, not a multifamily household development.
right, but this doesn't say that it's limited to multifamily.
Or it doesn't say it's delimited to commercial. I didn't realize I was just looking at commercial properties here.
I didn't look at it that way. Yeah, I didn't think it referred to, because it's,
So if I was building a wood shop construction space out on West Kingston, I'd have to make a gathering space with picnic tables and a barbecue pit? Is that what we're saying here?
Again, I didn't write this.
Like, I don't,
Right.
I guess I don't
well,
understand.
we can send that message back to Randy,
Wait,
because
what-
this is under landscape design approach and standards, and it's not broken down really into commercial versus residential, other than the obvious ones with parking, and I think the streetscape plantings and amenities, number 14, applies more to a main street, not necessarily a subdivision. When you talk about benches, bike racks, that's pedestrian corridors, that's more along Main Street, kind of a,
Right.
or at least,
I guess I
Item
want
14 is.
clarification.
but
Again, I view these 5 pages are things that you're evaluating and potentially want incorporated into any modern updates to a landscape code.
Right, but landscape code for commercial development.
Commercial, industrial, multifamily, and you need to define what multifamily is. And in most instances, that's things above a duplex. Because in most instances, in some of our zones, duplexes are allowed by right. And a standard duplex with 2 or 3 bedrooms in a duplex is, you're looking at 6 to 8 cars from a development standpoint.
Although item number 11 would be appreciated in a residential subdivision as opposed to something else.
And again, from my perspective, any public spaces you're requiring a developer to do associated with single-family subdivisions should be part of the subdivision regulations and clear in that section, not buried in the landscape regulations for commercial code.
Because you're right, unless it's an FDRP, yeah.
They're not even picking up the zoning code, they're just
Right.
looking at the subdivision regulations.
Yep.
And again, I don't want to say South Kingstown's unique. It's unique in some of my experiences that some of your zoning standards and codes are contained in your subdivision regulations, and then some of the things for the subdivision regulations are contained in your zoning code. Typically, in most aspects, if you're subdividing land, you go to the book associated with regulations on my subdivision. The only thing zoning controls is lot size and setbacks. But I'm looking at book A, I'm not looking at A and B and trying to figure out which one applies to me.
So is there anything else on page 4? Because it would be great to get through page 5 so that all of this can be sent to Randy. Go ahead.
I also have on number 16, the last one on page 4, a post-construction landscape inspection. Who is performing that inspection?
The municipality would be, or a representative of the municipality. I think it depends over time what the skill set of staff is.
But it's not the developer or his brother-in-law. Like
Well, the landscape architect has to anyway sign off on it,
Yeah.
which means that they will have had to inspect it, in theory.
In theory,
Right, I guess I just
not
wanted
in
to,
practice.
I want to understand who was performing this inspection and if we need to clarify.
In the end, the town determines compliance with the approved plans. At least for the last 5 years, I haven't solely relied on a letter signed by an individual that makes a statement it's in substantial compliance and the landscape architect has not set foot on the property, or they were not the design landscape architect, they were just someone called in at the end. You know, we have root balls for mature trees that aren't 2.5 times, they're not staked, they're, you know, some are a foot too deep, some are a foot too high.
So should this paragraph then be,
It needs to be expanded.
yes?
And then I have 2 on page 5, unless we're out of time.
We're good, we have 10 minutes.
Okay, so on page, are we done with page 4?
Yes.
So on page 5, my question for number 2 is in perpetuity, and who monitors this? All dead, diseased, and damaged plants shall be replaced. And then also the question is the same as number 5. The municipality reserves the right to inspect landscape areas at any time following installation. In perpetuity, for a period, like, we need to clarify that too, and who's doing
Yeah.
what monitoring?
So I'll try and give you an analogy or an example. everybody familiar with Garden City in Cranston? The northern portion, which is the, cute replica of a main street. When sites like that get approved and their landscape plans get approved associated with that, there is an implicit intent that the owner of that property will maintain and care for the landscaping that was approved. There isn't a limitation on a developer that after 10 years or 20 years, they no longer have to adhere to their landscape plan. They can go in and, cut all the trees down and rip all the landscaping in and replace it with mulch and, artificial grass. If someone did that, in my view, they would be in violation of their original approval. The intent is, if you plant a buffer, perpetuity is forever, but there is an intent that you will maintain that or allow that vegetation that was planted in association with the development to mature and go through its life cycle. Trees don't always last forever. Shrubs and bushes don't, they're susceptible to disease and blight and just normal wear and tear. I mean, I was involved in a couple projects where I'm savvy enough now that when you approve larger commercial properties, that if someone's planting street trees that are intended to be shade trees over time for the parking lot, that in the approvals and in the approved site plans is that those trees are intended to be maintained and allowed to grow to their natural form and not have a developer after 6 years coming and make large red maples topiaries. And I think I've showed you some examples of that
Or
in
limb
the
up
last
a
5 years.
buffer of conifers.
Yes. Correct, and that was viewed as a violation to the originally approved plan. They went in and spent thousands of dollars on planting understories. So if you go internal to that site, there was a revegetation plan enacted. You can't replace, you can't drill holes in the tree and put fake limbs back in. If a developer decides to cut something down and it's 30 feet tall, we can't go back and put a 30-foot tree there. So 2 and 5 are both in perpetuity? 2 and 5 are intended to be, plant material needs to be maintained and allowed to go through the life cycle as approved on their site plan.
So number 2, if it's 3 years later or 4 years later, and we got a bad winter or everything died,
So
now we can still go back and
we'll look at Chipotle's, right? They had a landscaping plan. They had to do some street trees, shade trees. They had some ornamental plants. They had some shrubs. If next year they go and rip everything out, they would be issued a violation because they're not compliant with their approved plans. Their landscaping needs to stay in place and mature naturally.
So Jamie, item number 6 actually is strongly related to 2 if there is an issue.
Yes.
We have 5 minutes left, but it would be nice to finish up a little before that. Does anyone else have anything on page 5? So if not, Jamie, the next step would be to get these comments back to Randy and then set a meeting with him for the next
The
kind of,
and we'll talk about it a little bit more during the regular session tonight.
Yep.
I will be at the Congress of New Urbanism in the middle of May. You have a meeting scheduled that week on Tuesday. I was going to bring up with you the potential of combining your May meeting and the one meeting can proceed with Mr. Wagner on that work session. And that could be a call made a week in advance of that, too.
And what's the date of that? That you're-
May 13th, I think, is the next regularly scheduled.
So that would be the one that we would incorporate into
Your second meeting
the
in May.
regular, which is May. And yeah, we can talk about that. That would be May 26th. Okay. If we're, because Jamie will be at a conference, if we incorporate the May 12th items.
Sorry, Madam Chair. Also, that May meeting is scheduled, Lynn just reminded me that it is scheduled.
Oh, there's
The
a
second
holiday.
Yeah, the second meeting is scheduled for Thursday because of Memorial Day. Correct, Lynn? So that would be May
Mhm.
28th.
So this is for our regular, this is incorporating the work session into the regular session.
Yes, so your meeting scheduled for the 12th would be combined with
Yes.
your meeting on the 28th.
And you'll find out from Randy when he's available so that we can figure out whether we have a standalone meeting or
In front of that.
add this
correct.
on to something and ask everyone. Okay? Thanks, everyone.